This is StoryBeat, storytellers on storytelling. StoryBeat explores how artists and creators of all kinds craft their stories. So join us as we reveal how master storytellers develop and build brilliant stories that people the world over love and adore. Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. I'm Steve Cuden, coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today is a true creative whirlwind, comic book and graphic novel legend Wendy Pini, creator, writer, and artist of the extremely popular, award-winning, multi-million-selling comic book series Elfquest. First, a bit of background. In 1978, Wendy and husband Richard Pini co-founded Warp Graphics so that they could independently produce Elfquest. 40 years later, the graphic novel series is still going strong. From 2007 to 2010, Wendy developed and produced her adults-only graphic novel based on the classic Edgar Allan Poe short story, Mask of the Red Death. Wendy subsequently turned Mask into an animated webcomic that received millions of online views. Then she took things one step further by collaborating with composer Gregory Neighbors and dramaturg Calvin Remsburg as she completed the book and lyrics for a musical adaptation of her version of Mask of the Red Death, which had its first official industry reading in October 2014. In 2012, Wendy and Richard Pini joined a growing list of comics industry pioneers who've donated their entire body of work to the library archives of Columbia University, New York. Wendy's artwork and writing are now permanently available to students and the public for study. Wendy remains extremely active as she is currently producing Elfquest: The Final Quest, which is now published by Dark Horse Comics. The concluding issue of Elfquest: The Final Quest is slated for release in late February 2018, exactly 40 years to the day of Warp Graphics' release of Elfquest issue number 1. Wendy, welcome to StoryBeat. What an amazing career you've had.
Well, hello, Steve. It's wonderful to talk to you. I miss you. We used to hang out a lot before you went off to the wilds of Pennsylvania.
Yes, I did. I joined the Pennsylvanians again. So tell us a little bit. We're going to focus today on process and how you do things, not so much on the end product, but on how you do things. And so let's just start in the beginning. What were your earliest inspirations? How did you get to where you are today? What brought you here?
Well, growing up on a somewhat isolated ranch in Gilroy, California, and being sort of a fanish mentality almost from birth, I was really into TV and movies, and especially attracted to animation, the traditional 2D kind of animation.
What was it? Shows or movies, or what were you attracted to?
Anytime I could get to a movie theater that was showing a fantasy or horror film, I was in the 60s. I was particularly fond of Roger Corman's Poe series.
Mm-hmm.
And also any animated feature that ever came to town, I would sit through it 3 times. Remember back when they used to show a matinee over and over again?
Oh yes.
Through the afternoon.
Oh yes, and you could watch 6 hours of movies without batting an eye.
Absolutely. I guess that was the first time people binge watched things. But so what happened in 1961 was our old buddy American International. Remember that?
Roger Corman.
Yes, Roger Corman, and they also released the Toho Productions, Mothra, and all those wonderful Japanese films.
Oh yeah.
Well, they released the very first animated anime feature film in America. It was called, in the American translation, it was called Alakazam the Great. It was actually an animated retelling of the famous and very, very old Buddhist legend, The Way West. So in this film, excuse me, not only was I introduced to a brand new kind of animation I had never seen before, because up till that point, I knew Warner Brothers and Disney. But here was a revelation. I did not know that sort of thing could be done in animation, or that sort of serious deeply philosophical story could be told in animation. So it completely blew my mind.
It wasn't frivolous and just kid stuff.
Not in the least. In fact, characters died. It was, it never occurred to me that animation could be more than kid stuff. So at the age of 10, I went quietly out of my mind, and this informed my desire to tell stories for the rest of my life, basically. The film was designed by and partly directed by Osamu Tezuka, who is considered to be the Walt Disney of Japan, and he became my long-distance sensei.
How did you contact him? What did you do to get in touch with him?
Well, I was never able to until 1980. I believe it was 80 or 81 that a number of great Japanese manga and anime people were brought over to San Diego Comic-Con. So I was able to meet Tezuka Sensei in the early 1980s, which, I'm surprised I didn't faint right on the spot when I met him. But I gave him a drawing of the lead character in the Alakazam the Great movie, which is Goku the Monkey King.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave him a drawing of Goku the Monkey King alongside my little hero Cutter, who has some of the elements of that character. There's a little bit of the Monkey King in Cutter too.
Sure, you've definitely been influenced by that.
Oh, no doubt. And as I understand it, he kept that on his desk. It is his desk has been preserved, and as I understand it, that drawing is still on his desk.
Wow.
To this day, yeah. So full circle, I got to meet my sensei, and by the time I got to meet him, I was already several years into producing the Elfquest series with my husband Richard.
And what kind of work inspires you now?
Well, I wouldn't say it's so much work as it is anything that makes me passionate.
Such as? What makes you passionate?
Music. I absolutely have to have some kind of music, passionate, emotional, deep, melodic music going on while I'm drawing. That will really get me going. There's something about how the line of a beautiful melody will attach itself to a line I am drawing and make that line beautiful. It's almost as if the two are one and they flow together.
That's fascinating. You actually feel the music actually influences the way you draw itself.
Yes. I can go back over the 40 years of Elfquest. I can pull an issue of Elfquest off a shelf and flip through it, and I can tell you what I was listening to on a given panel.
That is amazing. That's kind of like when someone has bits and pieces of music that define their entire life.
Yes.
And you can actually state exactly where you were and what you were doing to that music at that time.
Absolutely. In my very early days, let's say I was around 8 or 9 years old, my uncle, who lived in Berkeley, introduced me to Puccini. He gave me an album of Puccini's Turandot, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's probably Puccini's most exotic work, and it was unfinished, but he did some of his most amazing and intricate melodies in Turandot.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my introduction to opera. None of this baby steps. He pushed me into the deep end.
You had a baptism by musical fire.
Baptism by musical fire, and again, that's the kind of thing that just makes me passionate. Dance makes me passionate. Theater makes me passionate. Gorgeous sunsets. What's going on outside of me in the world, anything that is beautiful or inspiring or moving or just gets the blood going, that's where I get my inspiration for my work, because my work is always a translation of my perception of life. I don't believe that there's much use for fantasy, really. Poof, here's a dragon, poof, here's a unicorn. I don't go for that kind of fantasy. when I tell a fantasy story, it's really a metaphor for some kind of human experience.
Story has to have meaning. It has to
Yes.
mean something to your viewers, your audience.
Yes.
And if
Yeah.
if it doesn't,
Otherwise-
it's not worth doing, I don't think.
Well, you could practically finish this interview for me because you and I are very much in tune about storytelling.
Well, that's what we've done all of our lives. We've told stories. Frankly, what I teach in my classes is that storytelling is what we all do just to talk to each other all day long. But what you do and what I do and others that are professional storytellers, we make it into a form that is palatable and understandable. And that's what you do so well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've heard it said, and this is a saying I really, really adore, that the most personal experiences are the most universal.
Very good.
So, you get up in the morning, you had a bad night, you try to make your coffee, you try to get your act together for the day. That's the beginning of a story. And your day is the story. I taught a class once at a metaphysical expo called You Are the Hero. And it was basically getting people to realize that you can start anything you want to say about yourself with once upon a time.
Interesting.
And I would ask members of the audience to stand up and say, okay, describe your day to me, but start it with once upon a time. And then tell me what happened. And you use those magic words, once upon a time.
Wow. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Oh, well, I would be very glad to share with you my format for teaching that class. It was a powerful tool because people don't realize that every day they live a story. But I think for some reason I was born realizing that. My story was kind of dramatic in the sense that I was, born on the wrong side of the blanket, born with multiple birth defects. There's every reason why I shouldn't have survived or thrived, and I happened to be adopted within six weeks to a family that was extremely difficult, but somehow managed to expose me to classical literature and classical music. Shakespeare, I was exposed to Shakespeare when I was 5.
Wow.
Yeah, and Hamlet was my favorite, by the way.
Is Hamlet still your favorite story? Is that what still moves you?
In certain ways, yes. And do you know, when I was a very young kid, do you know what my favorite line in Hamlet was?
It's probably not to be or not to be, but tell me.
No. It's when the nurse says, her eyes are open, but their sense is shut.
Ooh, that's fabulous.
That got to me. I don't know why, but as a little kid, it made me totally understand sleepwalking in just one sentence.
Well, I think that you, and as long as I've known you, I know you to be a very deep person, and so I think that you're empathic in that way, and that you have felt these things for a very long time. Clearly, since you're now telling us since you were a child.
Yes.
So tell me about how you work today. I'm sure your work approach has maybe changed somewhat over the years. How do you go about, you're talking about how you go through your day, that making the cup of coffee starts your day and so on. How do you develop a storyline for Elfquest or Mask? Do you have a method that you use?
Well, now here's the thing, and it's kind of magical. With regard to Elfquest, as you said in the introduction, we are now doing the final quest, which wraps up this major story arc for our hero's journey that we've been doing for 40 years. In the mid-90s, Elfquest was first optioned as an animated feature film, and I came out to Hollywood to work on it. So this left Richard behind to run Warp Graphics, and at the time we were publishing several Elfquest-related titles, not just my work, but working with other artists and writers. To that end, Richard and I felt it was very important to work out in a fairly detailed fashion a treatment for what the end of the story was going to be. We had always known that Elfquest was going to come to an end, and we had always known what the ending was, but we hadn't filled in the details. So in the mid-'90s, we talked and plotted over pizza, and I came up with a treatment that was fairly detailed for the final quest, and then I left for my Hollywood adventures. So now, 20-something years later, I am working using as the skeleton that treatment that we wrote in the mid-'90s for the story that I'm telling today. And what happens is I have the skeleton, but every day I think about how am I going to flesh this out.
So you don't have an outline. You don't know the detail of it.
Well, I do. I do know what's supposed to happen in every issue, but how it happens is the catch.
I see.
Because you think about what's your point of view? What is the theme of each issue? For example, we've got 6 issues left now. There's 24 issues in all of the final quest, and we're on the last 6 issues now. And every issue has its own particular theme. And then I ask myself, well, which of our cast of characters is the one that's going to carry that theme in the story?
Is that your protagonist in that particular episode?
Not necessarily the protagonist. Sometimes it's the Greek chorus.
I see.
Yeah. Sometimes it will be a background character who, in fact, pulls the whole thing together.
That's interesting.
Because they become the reader's point of view.
And so you keep just developing each episode or each comic book itself has its own particular theme, but it all ties into one great big whole?
Yes, there are. Final Quest is going to be 4 volumes as published by Dark Horse Comics, and in each volume it contains 6 issues of the comic, which all 6 issues are designed to combine to create one graphic novel. So not only do I have to do individual issues, but I have to think about how they will all meld together so that you can read them seamlessly as a graphic novel in one volume.
And when you're go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish.
No. You go ahead.
I was going to say when you're sitting there trying to figure out how to solve a problem. Well, actually, beyond the problem, when you're coming up with a new issue, do you think of story first or character first? What drives the various books?
I think at this point, story, because I like to talk about inevitability. Richard and I do interact quite frequently with our fans online. We have an Elfquest fan page, and it's very delightful to the fans when Richard and I come on and answer questions for them and that sort of thing. And some of them say, oh my gosh, things seem to be happening so fast now in the story. And I like to talk to them about inevitability and say that a really good story pulls you along with it and has a certain inevitability to it. You might not love the direction that it's going, but you can see how it couldn't have gone any other way. And so you take the ride. It's like taking the ride on a particularly, vicious or intense roller coaster.
Do you feel that your stories almost always have an air of inevitability to the way that they work out?
I think so, because I'm really locked into the Joseph Campbellian hero's journey.
I've never heard Joseph Campbell called Campbellian, but that's good.
Campbellian. Not that I religiously, to the point of being overly rigid, follow all the rules of the hero's journey as Joseph Campbell laid it out. But the elements are there, and you cannot fail to tell a meaningful story if you do follow through with those elements of the hero's journey. And when you can feel that transformation coming, you get very excited. There's that's what makes people passionate about reading and hearing stories, is they are being taken on a journey. They know they're going to be transformed at the end. They might be scared. You might be taking them to a very scary place, because change is scary. But if you can take your readers to a place where they are not the same at the end as they were at the beginning, you have really succeeded.
Well, that's what we focus on in screenwriting here at Point Park. In that, every story should have some form. It's helpful to have some form of a character arc, which is what you're talking about.
Oh, of course, yes. That
characters go through some kind of a journey in which they start with a want of some kind and wind up with a real need. It's helpful to think about the story in an arc form. Well, here you're not just arcing an individual episode, you're individualing an entire series over 40 years. That's a miracle.
I don't know if it's a miracle, but it's been tremendous fun. It's, Richard and I, it has just carried us along these 40 years so that it seems, we constantly look at each other and say, boy, that went by fast.
Yeah. Well, I understand that problem of time compressing and going incredibly fast. But to do what you've done for such a long time, are there any particularly important techniques that you use in order to keep fresh?
I wouldn't say it's so much a technique as it's something that we established from the very beginning of Elfquest. Most fantasy stories are about good versus evil. They are dualistic. Heaven and hell, Sauron and Strider.
Mm-hmm.
On and on and on. And there's this sort of black and white way of looking at things. From the very beginning, Richard and I didn't want Elfquest to be a story about good versus evil. The conflict in Elfquest comes from change and the resistance to change. And the archetypal battle in Elfquest is the triumph of knowledge over ignorance. Because we believe that change can be affected when you're ignorant about something and then you take the trouble to learn and change your mind, and then you can adapt.
Well, certainly that's some of the most powerful storytelling follows that sort of form. One of the things that I admire is Leo Tolstoy's quote that he felt that the very best stories came from good versus good, which always tweaks my brain a little bit.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely, because two entities can be everybody. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, everybody's the hero of their own story.
Absolutely.
So, good is a relative term.
Is
Dr. Doom good? Is Reed Richards good? I mean, are they categorically good?
Well, is Batman good? It's all those things.
Is Batman good? I mean, that question's being asked over and over again these days.
Sure, and it's definitely a question when you have two characters that are really just trying to get through life, and they each have a goal that seems valid to an audience, and when they clash, wow, that the sparks can really fly.
Oh, I know, because when you have two characters that are equally lit up with passion for their particular point of view, and neither one of them is wrong, how exciting is that?
That's incredibly exciting. If you can get there, that's really something powerful.
That's where we've been going with our two lead characters in Elfquest are Cutter and Skywise.
Yes.
And Skywise is the character who has always wanted to evolve to go home to the stars, which is where the elfin race in our storyline came from. His dearest, most beloved friend is our hero Cutter, who is mortal and wishes to remain mortal and stay on the world of two moons and live out life as a wolf rider. And so both of them are right. Both of them are choosing exactly what's right for them, but Skywise wants Cutter to go to the stars, and Cutter would love it if Skywise would stay. So they're both coming from passionate points of view, and my goodness, there's been no end to the way we've played with this theme throughout the story.
Well, it's amazing to me because I'm not sure that within my world and many of the people that I know who are professional writers that you could maintain and sustain a story for as long as you have. I give you my hats off to you for that.
Thank you.
it's exceptional. Most people can barely sustain it for a year's working on a single script, let alone, or a book for a few years, let alone years and years and years. So I find that really great. I do want to talk for a moment about a little bit else in what you do. I know that you have not only do you like to listen to music so that it inspires you, but you also write music, and that you've written a musical called Mask of the Red Death, as we've talked about. I'm just curious how, in writing both the graphic novel and then subsequently the musical, did your approach change in any way that differs from Elfquest?
Oh my goodness, yes. Writing the musical has been an incredible learning process. The musical is based on my graphic novel, Mask of the Red Death, which is a very dark, dystopian, apocalyptic, kind of horror story.
Based, by the way, on a short story that has no real plot.
Exactly so, but it's my favorite Poe story. I was introduced to it through the Roger Corman version, and the script in that version decided that the protagonist, Prince Prospero, was a devil worshiper, and this was the reason for everything that he did. And so at the end of the story, it becomes a cautionary tale of, well, you reap what you sow, and, if you worship evil, you will be consumed by evil. And that was the message of Roger Corman's Mask of the Red Death.
Yes.
But Poe was anything but a moralist. He simply told you what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
He never judged his characters. He never asked you to judge them. He just asked you to come to the party. And I suppose this is why I've always loved the story, because I don't like stories that have really heavy morals. I don't like stories about good and evil. I like stories that just tell me what happened.
Well, certainly that story is exactly that, and it leaves you at the end not knowing what the heck is going to happen, and it just sort of stops. We just get it's a cold stop, and it leaves you with all these questions in your head. And so that the question that I have for you is, you took that. Of course, I also have worked on things that you're aware of, especially Jekyll and Hyde, that really there's no plot to hang your hat on. What did you do to develop the plot of the graphic novel before you then turned it into a musical? What did you go through?
Well, first, can I take a moment to say I can't tell you how much fun it is to be talking to you, because I'm your fan. I mean, I am a Jackie through and through.
Well, thank you.
You and I met at a party where I was able to fan all over you about Jekyll and Hyde, and so to be able to do this interview with you now, how much fun is that?
I know, and you can't believe what it means when I walk around and I tell people that Wendy Pini is a fan of mine, and they go, "What?"
I am declaring it to anyone who's listening to this now.
Thank you. Thank you for saying so.
But going back to your question, how did I take an 8-page story that had no real plot and turn it into a 400-page graphic novel?
Yes, I think that's a good question.
I did it by asking myself a question, which was, what would have to happen to a man's heart and soul that would enable him to turn his back on the suffering of his people?
Wow.
And just party. Because that's the basic premise of Mask of the Red Death, is you have a prince of an unknown kingdom, and the kingdom is being ravaged by a terrible plague.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of doing what he can to help his people, this prince takes 1,000 of his nobles, and they wall themselves up inside his castle, and they party their brains out. And when the Red Death finally seeps in and takes all of them, there's no real moral to the story. It's just that if there's any kind of a moral to the story, it's that you really can't turn your back on your fellow man.
Wow.
And so I got all of that out of those 8 pages, and that's how I was able to get 400 pages of story, because I came up with the characters. I decided, let's take a look at Prince Prospero. He's not really defined at all in the Poe story, but why does he do what he does? And it turns out that in my version, he's a rather sympathetic character. You can, by the end of my version of Mask, you can understand why he turned his back on the world. He has a marvelous song in the musical called Everybody Leaves. And this is the song where he just sings out his pain and his anger at his just disappointment and frustration with humanity, and how he has every reason to turn his back on them because they turn their back on him.
Do you think that that's the way our world is turning? Is that a reflection on where we are?
I think it's a commentary on how a lot of people feel. I watch my news feed every day on Facebook, and people often just, I suppose because they think it's anonymous, they just spill their guts in their Facebook comments. And I see a lot of despair. I see a lot of people just being fed up with their fellow man, and I'm going to go eat worms.
And rather than tell that, and rather than sit down and write it out and tell a story about their frustrations and so on, instead they take it out on the internet.
Mm-hmm. I think so. They are still telling a story, but, wherever I can, I try to tell people, sometimes if a close friend says to me, well, this, and this happened, I say, you should write that down. That's an incredible story.
And if you don't write it down, sometimes it just goes away.
Sometimes it just goes away. But Steve, I'm sure you've encountered this in teaching. The type of person who can discipline themselves to take passionate emotions especially emotions that upset them, and organize them, and then sit down and write them out as a story. That's kind of a rare person.
That's true.
That's like 1 in 100, or maybe 1 in 1,000 can do that.
That's true, and sometimes those people can actually become quite effective in society in putting their thoughts down. And sometimes it turns out that you can do it in graphic novel form, too.
Absolutely. I think some of the best stories come out of complaint. I think complaint... Well, let's look at Jekyll and Hyde for a second.
Yes.
Look what you did with Jekyll, because he's not much better defined in the original.
Oh no, there's nothing.
Story.
There's nothing to hang a hat on that story. There's nothing. There's nothing there.
So your experience with Jekyll was very much like my experience with Mask of the Red Death.
Right. Exactly.
You got inside Jekyll's head. His complaint was, why is there good and evil? Why does man always give in to his baser nature? What if we could separate those two natures and he could follow his higher nature? Wouldn't that be great? I mean, what a mission.
It probably would be great, although, I think ultimately that would lead to all sorts of other problems, which we won't deal with today. But for sure, it's that's again the good versus evil. Could it be good versus good argument? I think is plainly there, and Stevenson and Poe were, I think, kindred spirits in many different ways.
I certainly think they were. I think they were both in their way romantics. And the romantic mind is a very fevered kind of mind that looks at possibilities and
both
yearns for ideals.
And both wrote in an era where there were no computers, there were no cars, there was none of the technology that we enjoy today at all. So they really had time, I think, to think more deeply than a lot of us do.
And drink more.
And drink more. So let me explore just for a moment how you get from writing the graphic novel to translating that into a musical. What different part of your creative brain did you have to use to do that?
Well, I could hear the music. I could, my mind is full of certain types of music that has inspired me over the years. Oddly enough, one of the strongest inspirations for the type of music I wanted, and I shared this with my composer Gregory Neighbors, was the music of Dominique Frontier in the scoring of the 1960s Outer Limits series.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, in my version of Mask of the Red Death, I made it futuristic and science fictional. And so the idea of music that evoked a futuristic, technical, highly advanced civilization, that would all have to be there. But in addition to that, there would have to be the humanity, the heartbreaking description in music of a love affair where the two protagonists are perfect for each other, but they just can't quite get together, which is the love story in my version of Mask of the Red Death.
Well, that's the definition of conflict, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Because when two lovers are perfect for each other in so many ways, but in certain ways they just can't see eye to eye. It's like two ships passing in the night. They just miss each other. And that's the tragedy. That's what makes the story a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. All right, so just wondering, as an artist and as a writer, I'm sure that I want to talk about your actual physical space so that our listeners can get some semblance of what a real professional goes through over a long time. I'm sure that what you do is physically demanding on you, on your body, on your neck, your arms, and your shoulders, and so on.
Yes.
What do you do? How is your office set up, or what do you do in order to, not become debilitated by it?
Well, it becomes absolutely necessary for you to be connected to your body and to know when your body is straining itself past its limits. Being a writer-artist and sitting in a chair for umpty hours a day is not necessarily the slug-like sedentary.
No way.
No. You strain yourself. I do have a wonderful case of bursitis in my right arm from drawing too much, and I have to take care of that because my arm will lock up on me sometimes. Because it is entirely possible to draw or write too much, and you have to be aware of yourself and when your body is crying out for attention. I have an inversion board, which is absolutely vital to me at this point, hanging upside down and popping my vertebra and just, because when you sit for many hours a day working, your spine tends to collapse on itself.
It compresses.
It compresses. So you need to do something. If you don't have an inversion board, I highly recommend hanging upside down on your bed. Just hang off the end of your bed upside down.
There's a good trick.
Yeah. It's very important to get the blood rushing to your head and also it has to do with your heart. If you're sitting for many hours a day working, sitting is no good for you. You have to get up every half hour, and you have to pay attention to your heart because when you're sitting, your circulation slows down.
So part of your day is to be conscious of that and to actually take care of that. You can't let that go.
No. I think about what we're hearing nowadays about how many artists and writers are leaving us in their mid-60s.
Yes.
I mean, I'm 66, and I still consider that fairly young, and that's not out of vanity. It's just that, oh my gosh, I can't imagine leaving the world now. There is so much to do and see, and so much I'm still passionate about.
Well, and you're extraordinarily young at heart, so that's you've got miles to go before you sleep.
And I won't go gentle into that. Good night.
Let's see how many cliches we can drag out all at the same time. All right, so as we come to sort of the conclusion of today's episode of StoryBeat, I'm just wondering if you might have any wisdom or advice that you'd like to share with our viewers, some tip that they would find useful in their careers, their work.
Well, I find that young people, when I talk to them at conventions or I talk to them online, if they happen to be fans that I'm interacting with, I find that they judge themselves very, very harshly. And we happen to be living in very judgmental times because the Internet has made it possible for any Tom, Dick, or bozo to express their opinion, and they don't hold back. And so bullying and judgmentalism has reached a peak that is rather frightening. And I find that a lot of young people are afraid to express themselves. They're afraid to be judged. So the first thing I would say to you, if you are a young person who has a story or a song or a poem inside them, but you're afraid to put it out there because someone might bite your head off for it, what I would say to that person is, it's always about the critic. It's always about the bully. It's not about you. Look at it this way. If you put something out there and somebody attacks you for it, it means you've moved them. It means you've touched them in some way and they don't know how to respond to it in any other way but to attack. They did not ignore you. What you did had meaning for them enough that they had to respond to it in some way.
You touched them in a way in which they cared deeply.
Yes, and because they didn't know what else to do with it, they attacked. This means you will also get responses from people who feel love and passion for what you do. Because if someone bullies you for your work and judges you, it means you've done something that brought a rise out of somebody else. And that means you can affect people with your work. So I would just encourage young people to be brave about doing that and to realize that praise and blame is all the same. And criticism, it's not going to annihilate you to be criticized. It's all about the other person who's criticizing you. It's not about you.
Wendy, you are so wise, and I am so grateful to have you today on the show, and we're just so grateful that you're out there still telling these wonderful stories that people are enjoying wherever they are and in languages all over the world. So thank you so much for spending a little time with us on StoryBeat today.
Well, it was delightful to talk with you, Steve. I love clicking with you and sharing big thoughts.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks again to Wendy Pini. Today's tip of the day on StoryBeat is that you must, as a creator, move your audience emotionally. Motion picture stories, novels, television shows, plays are not about intellect or education or facts or science or numbers or anything like that in the mundane world. Movies are all about emotions. Novels are all about emotions. And so it is with all creative storytelling. Audiences want to be safely moved. They want to live vicariously through a story. Whether they know it or not, what they want to do is to feel what the characters feel. So fill your stories with characters that are emotionally invested in their quest. Find a goal and have them go after it with passion. Give your characters unavoidably emotional experiences. Movie makers, television creators are in the passion business. We sell feelings, not intellectual thought. So be sure your story exists on a deeply felt emotional plane. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.